The first individual present in this particular session is Jessica Finnegan, who is a graduate student at University of Cambridge. The title of her, her presentation, you see, is Measuring the International Impact of Technology. Now, Jessica is currently an advanced diploma student in the study of religion at the University of Cambridge. Her research centers on the intersection of technology and religion. She graduated from BYU in 2003 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Marriage, Family, and Human Development. And she and her husband, Tom, have 4 daughters, ages 6 to 11 years old. So, Jessica, we're excited to hear from you.
Just as a little more background to the introduction, my thesis centers on the history of technology and innovation within the church, and it pushes heavily towards the impact of the internet. So within my research, historically, the literature on technology and innovation has pulled from very deterministic theories, often going to very utopian to very apocalyptic ideas of how technology will interact with religion. So I wanted to move beyond that framework and really examine how we can look at religion and technology within the church and how they interact. And within that framework, I really have found some interesting things and how the church really does advance a lot of the theory and a lot of the understanding of where we think religion and technology and innovation intersect. Let's see. So I pull heavily from another professor's work in Texas. Her name's Heidi Campbell. She is a communications professor, and she tried to move beyond this theory, and no one has ever implemented this within the church. So her research goes from things such as the kosher cell phone, which is very interesting, to the way the Amish communities have actually negotiated how to use cell phones and telephones within their communities. So she definitely moves beyond a very simplistic model into this complex negotiation within social structures. So as a side effect from my research, though, I should warn you that if you're ever in a church meeting with me and we discuss technology, I'm always the one raising my hand saying, like, we don't really have enough data to make that assumption. Well, maybe we should think about it a little bit differently. I'm sure I drive everybody crazy. This is the clicker. So let's see. So as I said before, the church definitely does add a lot to the existing literature, which I'm very excited about. So this is a bell curve. So within every organization, every community, this is the general distribution of how people react to innovation and technology. The lay structure within the LDS Church actually provides a very interesting lens through which to view this structure. We see, because we pull people from callings and leadership positions from everywhere from nuclear physicists to philosophy majors, we get a very different negotiation process where it's not such a pull and push that you see in other literature, where it's more of a symbiotic relationship where we just sort of progress naturally and we negotiate in a much more much more natural patterns, and it's not quite the jarring negotiation that we see in other communities and how we react. So here's an interesting story. So my father-in-law sold computers very early on within the PC movement. So he would bring home the broken ones, and my husband and his brothers would fix them up. But my mother-in-law, so they were on the more early adopter side, because this is before the internet. This is BBS's, very early. And my mother-in-law was not quite the early adopter. so this is how the interchange happened. She was very against them using BBSs, which is a precursor to the internet, if you're not familiar with it. She would, and rightfully so, right? Like, she was just worried about the power of the technology and the predators who might be online for, children using the internet. And then the church came out with LDS.org. And he said that was the best dinner conversation they've ever had, because he was like, well, if the church has a website, then I think the internet is just fine. And she couldn't push. So it's just this, how they were pushing, and early adopters, definitely if you see within the history of the church, they are definitely, as you can see, computer scientists was in the church, and especially at the U of U, as they had a really good computer science program. And now at BYU, but they were really pushing, not pushing, but they were definitely early adopters. Whereas I think, and I see this within talking to people, but I think the one thing that really gets everybody, especially even the people who might lag behind, is family history work. My mother-in-law might not want to use Facebook or any other apps, but she loves her genealogy programs, and she always has the newest one, and she doesn't know how to send emails very well, but she knows how to use these programs that I find quite complex, but she's motivated to push past her comfort zone. So within the theory, there's definitely this continual negotiation process. So I included some pictures from the church website. So families using the internet together, especially with small children, the gentleman in the bottom using their iOS and Android apps for church resources, and then siblings using an iPad. But it's definitely a lot more complex than just this, the church isn't pushing, like what I was saying is just a much more natural process. So it's impossible to really differentiate or to distinguish the history of the church from the history of innovation and technology. So we have to take into account every technology from the printing press, which we go from Europe, has already been altered by the time we get to the 1830s, to social innovation that allowed the religious markets within the United States to actually exist, to freedom, to the Constitution, to a lot of different innovations. So it's not just mainly technology, we're also looking at social innovations and expanding beyond just physical innovations. So the idea of the pattern is that we take what we've learned from the negotiation process in the past, and so we look at sewing machines, we look at how the church adapted to consumer products, to the printing press, to newspapers, to the television, and we really try to parse out what are the patterns so that we can try to predict how we can adapt and how we negotiate a little bit more effectively new technology and new media. So that's really the ultimate goal, because although history doesn't repeat itself, there are patterns that are repeating. And overall, we're very, very positive interaction with technology and the internet, technology, innovation, and the internet especially. But as this is an international conference, I wanted to talk about a little bit of the international aspects. And I think as we take these patterns and we understand the complex negotiation processes, and as other speakers in this conference have illustrated so eloquently, that it really is a more complex social system as you go back and you really look at the culture of each individual country and understand localization. It really does allow the internet to be used more effectively. And I think as you do that, it also allows, there's just overlap between using the internet effectively and missionary work. So it's not just doing all this research to progress how we use technology, but it's also how do we improve missionary understanding, and how do we understand how to deal with cultures. So this is a picture of This is from the World Bank. So this is from 2012. So, I mean, the problem with technologies is always changing. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here is the difference of Facebook. So this is different. I couldn't find any nice maps more recently than 2012. But especially a problem within Africa is the issue of infrastructure, and the difficulty of a lot of regions even getting enough internet capabilities to engage in Facebook. One other differing thing that I think that I noticed as we discussed, or as I started to research the international church, like the efforts within the church and the internet, was the issue of mobile phone traffic. So I want to take the first two, so Africa and Asia. And although like they're the highest two, the method, or like the technology they're actually using is quite different. Whereas Asia generally has a different, well, especially if you're in like more developed countries, they have a different like they have iOS and Android and much more like technology that we would see here. Whereas in Africa, although like in a lot of ways that's the only internet they have is through their mobile phone, and they're generally less powerful. I couldn't find any indication that we actually develop apps for that level of technology. Like we tend to do a more iOS or Android based app, whereas that really could be beneficial if we stopped and made apps for people who don't have the financial capabilities of buying a set of scriptures or having manuals, or I was thinking about how difficult it would be to take a set of scriptures and your manuals on public transportation with multiple children, and a lot of people travel quite a ways in cramped buses, and how actually using apps for those devices would be quite beneficial. Another thing that we need to do as we understand localization is to understand that not every part of the world is the same. We moved to England a year and a half ago, and one of the more shocking things that we came across was how nobody used LDS.org because of the privacy laws. So simple things, and it was difficult. We live in a highly expat ward too, and so the Americans talk about it, how it's opting in versus opting out is actually like a barrier to a lot of church communication. And when you live in a ward where boundaries span about 2 hours of driving, communication is quite important. We can't even produce a stake or a ward directory without consent of every person to have their name on it. And in a lot of cases, it has to be redone every year. So there's definitely local issues that pull more heavily or alter the conversation about the internet in the church. And as we discussed, there's lots of cultural differences within Asian culture. How do you invite versus how do you make sure that you're not pushing on people, that it's an organic negotiation process within that culture, and we're not pushing American technology on a culture who's not necessarily willing to or who would even optimize their life to use it. And I think as we process through that, like we also gain knowledge of letting them have their own process and then reflecting it back upon the church. So it's their process, our process, and we learn from both. So one thing I want to talk about, there are LDS tech chapters around the world, and they're actually growing most heavily in Africa. So these are local, BYU has one or a couple, local areas who help develop apps and technology for the church. there's logistical issues, but I think that's one area that would really benefit from an increased level of infrastructure and really processing through how do we encourage local members. One thing I was thinking is studies have shown that younger generations are no longer using Facebook. So I guess once your grandparents use it, it's not super cool. So especially under 16 have definitely started to leave Facebook, and for apps that might not be quite as conducive to sharing messages like Snapchat. And it'd be hard to, I was trying to figure out how the church would share missionary messages on Snapchat, but which is kind of interesting. One thing I was thinking that would be very interesting is to do entrance surveys of missionaries as they come into missions, like what social media are you using? What are your parents using? Who else is using this? Like how often do you use it? Just to get a much more clear picture of who's using what around the world. And you have a captive audience, so who are usually willing to be helpful, which is the problem with surveys. And then in closing, some of the most amazing, I teach gospel doctrine. One of the most amazing lessons that we have ever had are where we use these stories of pioneers around the world. We really tried to bring them in to church history lessons last year. And while the Dutch Potato Project, I didn't know there was a video when we did the Caring for the Poor and Needy, but we did read the story out of the Ensign. And this video has been shown all over our ward and stake. And I think that it's important that we have stories like this, not just because they're nice stories, but I think for the people who don't necessarily have an American background, that they really are essential to building to integrating them fully into the church. And I think as an American, like, it's impossible to watch them and not have your faith strengthened too. And especially listening to the stories from this conference and, the beautiful stories of pioneers in every country, it's just quite an important thing to do. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Just to have a minute here. Thought it might be of interest to know that that very picture that you're looking at of the Dutch Potato Project, 1 week ago today was shared at a United Nations meeting. And it was, in fact, it was dedicated, the sole focus of the meeting was titled Discovering Mormonism and Its Role in Humanitarian Assistance. And Sharon Eubank, who is the director of our LDS Charities and Philanthropies, used that story to illustrate and use that very picture because she wanted everyone to see the person in the middle of how happy he was to be able to share these potatoes. And it was actually a story of great sacrifice. And so I think we'll see that media is going to have a great effect on what we do in the church.